Hi, Vinnie. Thank you for having me back to speak to your audience again about the major findings that we have this year from the annual HR System Survey. We are now in our 24th annual review. Really excited to get a chance to talk to you and hear your questions about some of the research that we're doing this year.
Stacey, it's always nice to have you back. 24 years, my God. That's as old as I am.
Look at you. I know. I say I stopped at 29, but yes, no, we're getting up to our silver anniversary, which is sort of a little, I think about doing research for 25 years, right? It's kind of an amazing thing to think, not every question we asked all 25 years, but there's several questions, a number of questions that we have asked every year for 20 that we're able to go back and do some analysis.
I imagine, Stacey, this year was very interesting, right? With all the talent shortages and mass resignations and God knows what else. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, this year was harder than last year for me to do the analysis and the survey. And I think it was because last year, I think there was still a bit of, we're all working together, we're figuring this out. This year, the market is very split. There are some who have moved ahead, and there are some who are still really struggling with what's going on. And I do think that has caused a real disparate view of the data. So I'll show you a couple places where I think that's coming out. But I'd also love your view as you're talking to your customers and your clients and the people in the audience here about, are we learning anything from this process that we've just gone through over the last 2 years? Or do we think we're just going to kind of go back to the way we were meant? And I don't know that our data tells us that answer, but I do think it's something we all have to ask ourselves. So, yeah. For those of your audience, I think we've done this for now 2 or 3 years where we've sort of walked through the key findings of the survey, but just in case anybody who doesn't know sort of who I am and who the research is, there is this deck is our key findings deck, which they can find available on our website. So don't feel you have to take all these notes on this. The research
I'll include a link in the blog post that surrounds the video.
Perfect. Yeah, because I know that it's a lot of data that we share. And then just for anybody who sort of wants a better understanding of what we cover in 24 years of annual research, we really do a very large survey, which is much more of an interview, to be honest, with the respondents around their HR technology environment. And that includes everything that you see on this picture here in our HR systems adoption blueprint. It is all of the strategy, culture, data governance conversations that you have to really start the conversation with. It also includes all of the major categories of HR tech and all the supporting areas of HR tech, how they fit in with it. So a lot of times when people think about HR technology, we just think of what's in that middle, category there of the core HR, service delivery, time and talent, and emerging tech and analytics. But there's so much more. And Vinnie, this is the conversation you and I always have, right? Which is there's just so much more that goes into actually making technology have an impact in organizations. And I think if there's anything that we found this year in the research, it is that exact issue, that no matter how much you invested in technology, if you weren't developing the culture, the processes, the data cleanliness and sort of ethics, none of it was adding value to your bottom line through this process, because you had to rebuild all of that stuff in the middle of the chaos. So,
Stacey, this week, what you're saying came, as we're starting to visit offices again, client offices and so on. So I had one where, they sent me a form ahead and I filled out the vaccine information. I thought that was excellent, right? Yeah. Got there and the security goes, well, we don't have your form, fill it out again. Right?
Exactly, right?
So the other one, the executive, his admin called and said, hey, we're not allowing any visitors. He'll meet you at a cafe, right? So nothing to do with technology, just processes are we are making them as we go along. It's kind of interesting.
And it's not only that, we're making them up as we go along, we're also, I think, trying to figure out how they fit into, which I don't think we've ever, there has been brand and ethics and process conversations for years, for ages. But I do think that as we've gotten into the last 2 years and those topics have gotten much bigger and much broader, a process conversation quickly turns into a brand and a risk and an ethics conversation, much more so than I think we've seen in the past. And that, I think, is part of what's challenging HR more than they've ever been challenged before. Because yeah, we can make a process about who can come into the building and how they can come into the building, or what events we can go to or what events we can't go to. But there's also an element of brand that goes with that, right? And we've had some conversation about this where, yeah, but is it appropriate to be seen letting people in, or is it appropriate to have Matt, right? Like, or is it appropriate to send out a link to ask people to fill in all this information? There's that conversation too, right?
Well, and an attorney I talked to, he says many people don't realize they're collecting so much information from visitors, medical information. Hopefully they're not storing it. Hopefully they're deleting it. I mean, we're getting into new privacy areas that we haven't thought through.
Exactly. Which I think leads to why there were so many people who participated in the research this year. I mean, granted, every year we work really hard to get more people to participate, but this year we saw a 15% uptick in overall participation in our both the responses to the survey, which are always in that 4,000 range of people who sort of hit and participate in the research, but in the visible data sets, which means that somebody gave us enough data and it was a single company, because we do combine all of the additional organizations, right? If you get 6 IBMs or 20, GE people who respond, we combine them into a single response. We had over 2,177 individual organization data sets this year in our data, and that was 15% higher than last year.
Wow.
And I know and I think there was a little concern that, well, coming out of the, last year with, the pandemic at its height, when we were actually doing the survey in May, that people were just not going to be interested. And I think that it was the absolute opposite of that, is that when you are in chaos and you're trying to figure out which step to go, you need data, and you also need to think about what you're doing. And that's a lot of what I think our survey does for people, is it not only provides them some data back, but it takes us a while, because we take a while to analyze the data. It does provide them in that moment an opportunity to ask themselves the same questions I'm asking them, right? Like, what is our data governance strategy? How are we, what are we using our HRMS for, right? Are we using it to make business decisions, or are we just using it to gather data? It's a little bit of a self-reflection tool, I find, when I talk to a lot of HR technologists. And we did get.
That's a great point, Stacey. I mean, you're trying to quantify so many dimensions that people haven't really quantified, right? It's soft skill, soft HR always tends to be much more intuitive. So kudos to you for forcing them to think about it.
We try. It can get very uncomfortable. I had one person call me up one time, and she was like, she was just frantic because she had 6 people. It was a large retail organization, so it was very big and had a lot of different arms and legs. And she's like, I had 6 people responding, and we all responded differently to the same question, and I don't know what to do with that. And I said, well, that's a conversation you might want to have internally, and we'll take the data and we'll figure out which one answered the response the most fully, but we'll give you back your responses, and that gives you an opportunity to have that conversation internally, because it is, there is a lot of times where I think, particularly in the HR tech space, but across HR, like you said, where we feel like we're in a bubble doing our own work, but if we're not all on the same page, we're sort of all heading in a different direction, right? So this definitely pulls that out. The other thing that we got this year, which is higher responses from those organizations headquartered outside of the US, which was one of the things I'm always pushing for. So we got a about 2 to 3% uptick in our Asia members. So that went up to 13 total data set. And we got more this year in South America and the EMEA and sort of Africana and Middle East areas. 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but it's 1% of a much larger data set, right? And we generally have struggled to get data from those regions. And so we are starting to see interest in more data, more interest in understanding the HR technology ecosystem in all of those regions. And to me, that was a really good, exciting thing to start to see, is that we get, 100 to 150 responses from the South America market. That gives us an opportunity to start to look at trends there that we just couldn't look at, I think, because most of the time you're looking at it just, at an instantly 1 or 2 responses. So it was really good to see that. The other thing we saw this year is global organizations. And I thought this was sort of interesting that of those global organizations who participated, that the average number of places they had employees upticked dramatically. Those 742 global organizations, the average number of countries they had employees in was 34 countries. And this would be an interesting thing to get a sense from your customers, Vinnie, is we're seeing, particularly with the ability to work from anywhere, that organizations are much more open to having employees in different countries and different regions. They're still trying to figure out how that works, but it is increasing the overall number of where their employees are at. Are you seeing that as well in the conversations you're having?
Not just around countries, locations, right? People working from home, more states. Yeah, absolutely.
So
on the flip side, I think there was a false hope that the vaccines would allow us to open up offices more. That's been a much slower process. And you probably found that in your data.
Yeah. We asked what percentage of your workforce is currently working still in a work from home environment, and we are still at, I think, in the range of 30 to 40% of organizations with more than 50% of their workforce working in a sort of remote environment. And I think that was that we're starting to see that hybrid, but the number of who say they're planning to move everyone to come back to the office, that number is not ticking up. So we are still expecting that even after sort of we address the concerns about the pandemic, that we're still going to have about 25% of the market, at least. That's an at least, because I do think it could be more as the employees themselves start to push for this, who have a 50% or more of their workforce working from a remote environment at any one point in time. That's what our data showing. That was 6% just before the pandemic, just to give some numbers around that.
I've heard from a number of companies in my own experience, the 2-day phenomenon, right? Where going to the office 2 days, business trips only 2 days.
Yep.
Maybe fly one morning, come back the next night for different reasons, right? I mean, people have become very careful about travel and they're jamming much more into a day when they're traveling. So, I think the work pattern is definitely changing.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing about what we did in the research this year was that the demographic data of our survey respondents and the data about their companies was as interesting as the responses to the questions in general about their technology this year. So this conversation we're just having about where are your people working and what percentage of you are located in different regions. We also saw the way we approach small, medium, and large. So for us, small organizations or organizations under 2,500 employees, we saw a 9% increase in those organizations participating in the research this year. And that was a pretty big number. And what we realized is that, we had gone out and looked for a couple sources, some of that smaller data set. We had changed some of the questions, so it made it a little easier for them to answer. But we also think that audience is more interested because technology is what saved a few, like if you were a small organization and you were dealing with what was going on with COVID, technology was your friend, right? And so we saw lots of interest in the technology conversation coming out of the small market. We also saw this year in the industries, because we cover all the industries. We've got 15 or 20 industries that we track in this sort of as we actually categorize groups. We've always had finance, high tech, education have always been at our top percentages as participants. And those all still got high percentages, but the top two participating percentages this year from an industry perspective were manufacturing and healthcare. Those have always been high, but never top. So to me, that really showed again, a marked interest by those industries. We tend to see higher level, we're a little bit more like the canary in the coal mine, right? When we do our research.
I can understand the healthcare. Was manufacturing because people are moving more operations back? What did you figure out why manufacturing?
Yeah, we're starting to dig into that a little bit. What I think is that there's two reasons. I do think that there is the supply chain issue is a big talent conversation as well as a process conversation, right? And I do think too that particularly for manufacturing, COVID was an either all or nothing conversation. Either they had to thing or they were on high demand because they were a critical requirement. And so what you saw is that they couldn't deal with either of those, right? Like if they had to stop everything, they didn't know who to let go and who to keep. They didn't know how to maintain their talent pools. They were just stuck, right? With a lot of decisions to make and not the data they needed to make it. And if they were on high ramp up or demand, they had to quickly bring in people, handle healthcare issues, handle wellness issues, handle communication issues, and they didn't have the tools for that. I think particularly for manufacturing, this COVID crisis brought home the fact that they had not done the work they needed to do in technology. I mean, this is the exact issue that we're hearing from Amazon in this last week or two, right? They just had not taken the time to invest in their HR technology. And it comes home to roost when you're in chaos, right? So yeah, I mean, I do think that manufacturing has some opportunities, but I think that what we're hearing from talking to organizations is that they feel like, they're getting their arms wrapped around this picture a lot more. And this is the first part of it, is getting data. The other thing I think when we look at the key themes, and like I said, I won't go through all of the information here in detail.
Oh, please,
download.
I want to go through every bullet.
Every bullet, yes, every little piece, right? I'm just going to mention a couple of things. We really are starting to break our research out into these three really big buckets. It seems to be the categories that I think make the biggest sense from a conversation perspective. There's a lot of conversation about what's driving HR and how HR is a part of the business, right? So the business of HR is the business that they're in, and there's a lot of discussion about whether or not I do best practices or whether I address my work from an industry perspective or whether I address it based off of what my company themselves are needing. And so we have a lot of data here showing that, yes, there's a lot more investment going on. We are seeing more interest in the emerging technologies, right? So as a business conversation, not just a technology conversation now. And we are seeing that all the trends that we just talked about, the great resignation, the labor gaps, the skills gaps, the issues around what organizations, their new sort of post-pandemic work, right? Those are all an HR and an HR technology conversation. When it comes to how you achieve change, there we're seeing a lot more details in our research around what organizations have not prepared themselves for. And so here we're finding a gap in really important processes like internal mobility. We're finding sort of investments in areas like learning and automated workflows and chatbots that we didn't see prior to the pandemic, that they're now saying, look, I've got to invest in this. We're seeing a huge uptick in interest in skills management technology, but again, it's things that we just didn't take care of that we needed to, right? And even things like benchmarking, right? Because one of the things coming out of talent acquisition right now is that people are feeling that they're not being compensated fairly, right? Like, it isn't just that I can't hire people, it's that I could hire people if I had the right things that we could offer them. That means both compensation, benefits, and a work environment. And so they're putting a value on their hour, and we have to figure out what that value is. And so we're seeing an uptick in the percentage of organizations looking at compensation data, an uptick in the percentage of organizations looking at things like skills data sets. Those are all about gaps that we had that we just really are driving the challenges right now. And then when it comes to how organizations are feeling about their technology, which is what we call our voice of the customer and the feedback, because we do focus on providing insights into what people are seeing with their technology. Although we're challenged with these big business issues and we are struggling with gaps we had, customers overall were much happier with their HR technology this year. Just like no category saw an overall drop in the user experience and vendor satisfaction rating. So every user experience vendor satisfaction rating on average for every HR technology category had increased from last year. And we saw vendors who offered some of managed services, service delivery models, service support. Those saw higher increases than other HR technology vendors as well. So there was a tie-in to the services, but overall companies were it was a year of being grateful for their technology. It did something for them. It offered something, right? So nobody got slammed really hard this year, I think, on the feedback side. But even though we're not seeing a lot of people saying, look, I just absolutely need to replace all of my technology, it's just not working we're not seeing that kind of fervor like we saw 2 years ago in learning and development, and a few years back in recruiting, and a few years back in the HRMS space. We are still seeing this issue with achieving change. There's still real gaps that people are trying to figure out. The question is it a technology gap or is it a process gap, right? So those, if you're kind of looking at the big thing we found this year, these were sort of the big things that we saw.
I think the achieving change, I mean, it's not just HR. I'm seeing it in supply chain. I'm seeing it in a number of other functional areas. I think coming out of last year, we thought we would get back to some kind of previous normal.
Yeah.
2021 has taken everyone by surprise. Everyone by surprise. I mean, so nimbleness of organization. You made a point about data on technology is positive. I would say the other thing that probably is positive is how much people are learning from talking to each other.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can be too focused on employee experience and, get into what's called woke behavior. Yes. Frankly, you learn a lot more from your colleagues in different industries. So, there's some subtle changes that HR is having to make.
And I actually, the thing about this employee experience conversation, right? And don't get me wrong, I am all about improving the employee experience, but I think oftentimes we focus on the experience over the need, right? There are real and actual needs that employees have that we are not addressing, right? And I think we oftentimes, try and, it's the pig kind of conversation, right? Where, yes, I can make it easier for you to maybe sort of look up information because I've got a better user experience, or maybe I provide more opportunities for you to give feedback. But if I'm not addressing the real issues that you're having, like the fact that maybe I'm not paying, equitably, or maybe the fact that I'm not, addressing, the commute that you have, or I'm not addressing the fact that you're logging into 16 different HR applications on a regular day, right? Those are real needs that no matter what you do from a better experience, right? If you're not addressing those needs and you're just sort of making more opportunities for them to give feedback and more opportunities to have communication, eventually we'll catch up with you. And I think that's what we saw in the data this year, without a doubt. Yeah. And one of the things that we also saw this year, and you asked me a little bit to talk about, was this year harder than last year to do the analysis? One of the things that we have found over the years is that, we're just getting more data and asking more questions. We oftentimes forget how much more we're asking of ourselves as researchers, right? Because, there was such a difference between analyzing 1,000 responses for 200 questions to 2,700, 2,177 responses. That doubles the amount of work it takes for us to go through and validate things like, if they say they have a vendor, can we find some proof point that they've got that vendor, right? Like we do that for all the major responses in the major vendor data sets. We make sure that we can find that company. If they put the company name and they have an employee number set, we can find that number, we can validate the numbers that they've given us. We do that for every company in our data set, right? So it's a massive undertaking that we go through from the time we close the survey at the end of July to the time we start to share the data. And it takes at least 2 months to go through the cleaning process. And this year it was more complicated because the data wasn't coming out. Generally, year over year, you're going to get sort of, something starts to tick up or something starts to tick down. It's a few points above or a few points below. It's a nice thing about doing a year over year analysis is that you expect to sort of know at least what range you're going to get data in, right? When it gets so off of base, or the questions or the responses are so wide from what you would expect them to be, you have to take a step back and revalidate everything. Because you have to say, did they really say this, or did I mess up my equation, or did I mess up, did we ask the question differently this year, right? So for example, when it came out that every category of HR technology had a higher vendor satisfaction rating on average, I had to go back and look at every response and see, did we do something differently? Did we make a change that could be impacting this? One of the things we did, which could maybe equate for a percentage or two, not the huge number that we saw, is we added just a visual cue this year. We asked the same question with the same 1 through 5 rating. This year we added a stars at the bottom where they could see what those numbers equated to. Like if it was a 2.5, it was 2.5 stars, right? I thought, well, maybe the visual cue gave us a few points up. And we did look at what a person responded last year to the same vendor this year. Did we see a difference in that data set for that one company? And we didn't see enough of it was funny enough that it was like, yeah, no, the numbers weren't always equating to, yes, it's something that has to do with these stars. It could have caused a couple of people to put the number up a little bit. But you have to ask those questions. And when I delivered this presentation, the full presentation at HR Tech this year, I said, we had to question all of our data. We had to decide, do we use this data? Is it just a point in time? So if, the drop in HR Tech spending last year jumping up to this year, we're going to see that big of a jump next year? Probably not. It's a point in time that we went down and up, right? And so next year we'll probably see just a 1 or 2% increase, if that. But that's the same question that all of our HR technologists and HR practitioners are asking themselves. If I saw a drop in engagement this year, is that a point in time, or should I take that as a trend, right? If I'm seeing this inability to keep my top talent, is that going to end this year, or is this a trend we're going to have for 2 or 3 years? It's a conversation everybody's having about their data this year. And I think that was the most sort of interesting conversation I had at HR Tech was
Stacey, kudos, because as analysts, quite often we can be glib. So I'm glad you are soul searching and questioning, right? I mean, if the data looks too good or too bad, did I ask the right questions? So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, and we have to ask it of the practitioners have to ask it of their data this year too, right? If they're all saying, well, everybody's engagement is high, because we saw there were high levels of engagement scores coming out of 2020 because people were just thrilled to have a job to some extent, right? And but coming into 2021, the burnout rate was huge. And we, a little bit, I think, let that engagement rating of 2020 lull us into thinking that 2021, even if we started to ramp up again, people would stay, right? And I think that's the thing everybody who's got analytics or data, it has to start really thinking about is in the context in which they're getting their data and their responses, right? So this has been an interesting conversation to have all along, is that yes, we're dealing with this great resignation, labor shortages, addressing the skills gap pandemic, but the questions we should be asking ourselves isn't so much how we got here. We know to some extent how we got here. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, why didn't we understand that we were heading in this direction? Why did we not read our data differently? Why did we not understand the context differently? Because we know that we weren't paying enough. We knew that we weren't investing in talent management. We knew that we were not investing in skills gaps. But what was it about our data and the way we were reading it that didn't give us enough of a risk concern to invest in it, right? That's the conversation I think most businesses really need to be asking themselves right now. How do we read our data better to understand the decisions we should be making so that we can get in front of these kind of issues down the road? And is it possible even to, would that have not have been a thing to be able to feasibly see this? And I don't know the answer to that sometimes, but I think we all should be asking it.
I mean, this is, look, a lot of other functions. If you look at traders, if you look at, I was talking to somebody about the used car market, right? I mean, the ups and downs in the last 2 years have been like never before, right? How do you kind of normalize the curve looking forward? you almost have to become reactive. And we're not, as corporations, we're not very good at being reactive. That those are the people who've done well, is they look at a trend and they jump and they react to that.
And I would agree with you a little bit. I'll push back because I do think we need to be reactive, but I also think we need to be reactive with making sure we're gathering the data so we know what actions are creating, right? Shifting your business model quickly makes complete sense. Are we then burning out our employees while we're doing it? I think there are a lot of businesses that took some big shifts, made some big management decisions, and now they're paying a bit of a price because they didn't think through the implications of the changes they made. And so I would agree that we need to have flexibility. The one thing that I'm really seeing in the data, and broadly, right, is that, and I think this probably shows it better than anything, is that we have created a work environment where oftentimes we are optimizing so tightly that we don't have the room to shift or pivot. So for example, we're optimizing our work hours and now you don't have people who are cross-trained, right? We're optimizing our HR processes and you have everything being handled by an automated system. But when, someone has a real issue, they don't have a person to call, right? We're so tightly optimizing everything and then removing the extra, what we're calling sort of cost, which is really employees and workforce, but also time and investment in innovation. And what we're ending up with is a real issue where we're not valuing the voice of the need for not just employee experience, but the need for employee time. And I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but
No, Stacey, this is like, if you talk to the supply chain folks,
yeah,
for the last 20 years, we've had lean, keep inventory lean, at least of the valuable components, right? Suddenly a dollar chip is screwing up manufacturing, right? So we've optimized not just HR, we've optimized a lot of stuff a little too tight, and there's not much flex in it. So
exactly. Yes. And I think, and to me, this is a bit of a problem for HR and their perceived value in the market. So this chart here was, this is HR rating itself on how it feels it's being viewed by the business as a strategic business partner or not. And we've been in this sort of 38 to 40% range for years now. This is over 6-7 years that I just got on this chart. We've got this all the way back for 10-11 years, and the number's lower than that before that. And you would expect that as organizations invest more in HR technology and data and investments, that the role of the HR function would be seen as contributing more strategic value. Now, just to give you a comparison for your audience, we asked the same question in our finance and supply chain survey, and it's I don't have the exact number on me right now, but I think it's like 72% for the finance system or for the finance function, and it's like 68% for the supply chain function, right? So way above that 50% mark, not completely 100%. But here, HR has not gone above the 50% mark across the board year over year on average. And I thought this year would be the year we would jump up, maybe make a dramatic increase, saying, yes, HR felt like it really added value. And only 46% of organizations felt that their company feels they contributed strategic value to their organization right now. And I asked this question of HR, but I also have a lot of executives who respond to our surveys, particularly for mid-market and small organizations, and they don't rate this much higher. So this isn't just having sort of a bad feel about themselves. This is, executives generally don't have a really high value rating as well. The one difference I found this year was that those organizations who had higher profits now than they did in the post-pandemic era, outside of any industry issues or size issues or anything like that, right? Those organizations were above that 50% mark. So the 52% of those organizations felt that their HR function was contributing strategic value. Not a lot, but a big enough uptick in our data set to say, look, if you value HR and you invest in the people component of your business, I'm not saying you're gonna get a better outcome, but at least we're seeing better outcomes from those organizations in our data set this year, right?
Well, to your point about the point I was making earlier about agility, right? Last year, clearly diversity and inclusion, major point in most boards, right?
Yeah.
If HR continue to harp on that this year, they're so out of touch. People are like, get the people, man. Why are we still talking about that? Why can't you recruit? We're not, I mean, it's not an issue, shouldn't be an issue anymore, right? So that's what I mean by sometimes if you don't evolve, and unfortunately everybody has had to evolve multiple times in the last 2 years, then you look a little bit out of touch.
Yeah, and I don't disagree that HR creates a lot of their own challenges, right? Like we focus in the wrong spaces. We're a little slow on the uptick, but it also is to the point that HR doesn't a lot of times have the resources they need to spread out in the way that they need to. So I think this is it's a double-edged sword in a lot of cases. But I also do believe HR has to believe in themselves too, right? Like they have to be confident in what they're putting forward. So if you're talking about diversity and inclusion right now, you should definitely be talking about diversity and inclusion as a way to increase the number of recruits you have in your pipeline, right? Sure. Like that should be the conversation that you're having. And I think, it was an interesting data point to see that this year that we saw where we didn't see an uptick in the strategic value people felt HR was adding. We did see an uptick in the percentage of organizations who felt that their HR technology was being used to do things like inform the business strategy and influence workforce business decisions. Because that's the goal you and I are working for, right? Like we're really not working to replace your paper-based processes to help you figure that out. And we're not really trying to help you figure out how to get more data in and out of your systems. What we want as analysts, as industry gurus, as people in the market, right, is to say you're taking that tool and that data and it's influencing decisions you're making about your workforce and about your business. Because if you're not, then you're just wasting the money, right? And that saw a 10% increase this year. Now, again, these are self-reported, but I think based off of what we saw anecdotally in the market, this makes sense. People, whether it was easy or not, they took that data and they used it to inform business decisions in the last 2 years. And that to me is an indicator that we are trusting our technology and our data a little more than we're trusting ourselves and our processes, right? And then we are seeing upticks in spending to go along with this. So as I said, this was a year of being grateful for your technology. So you're going to see more increases in spending. That jumped up to about 47% this year. I think that's a little, my take will be that next year we might see another slight drop because there's a little bounce from everyone who had not invested in the previous year because it's slightly higher than where it was at in 2019. But I also think to me, this is a statement saying that, the world changed, but it didn't completely reform, right? Like the world changed how we're viewing it, but there still is going to be a similar amount of spending in HR technology, a similar amount of decreases. We're going to see the places that organizations are investing in their technology change a little bit as well. Last year and previous years, we always had investments in the HRMS and payroll as one of the top 5 areas where I was going to be doing investments. This year, it is all talent and all analytics and benefits, right? So we're seeing learning take the top spot across the aggregate. Recruiting is the next highest. When you look at small organizations, recruiting takes the top spot. When you look at large organizations, their number one plan for investments is in HR analytics. That's organizations over 10,000 employees. None of this is surprising. I think the 2 pieces that are a little bit interesting is that you're seeing an investment in skills management. We did add that this year. That was not on last year's list. So we don't know what it looked like last year, but there's definitely a focus here. And large organizations, this is the first time in any category that we've seen investments in intelligent tools. So for me, intelligent tools, and we have a definition when we give the question, is anything that has to do with machine learning, robotic process automation, sentiment analysis, that you're investing in anything that has that type of analytics capability beyond sort of just a planning and dashboarding tool, right? And so we give that definition, and this is the first year we've seen that any grouping or category said it'll be in their top 5 investments from a spending perspective. Do you think they know what they're investing in when they're talking about intelligent tools, and that they're actually going to make this a real investment this year? Or do you think this is still just a lot of buzz? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Vinnie.
I think actually there's a lot of spend that HR does not see, which affects employees, right? So I wrote a book about field service management this year. It's amazing the technology they have access to, augmented reality in the field, all their logistics, the navigation, logistics and all that. I don't think HR is very aware of what's happening in different operational areas, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if your survey actually asks them to talk about what tools are your workers seeing and whose budget is that going under, right? So HR tends to focus on its, how is machine learning affecting my data?
Yeah, exactly. Not yet, but it may be a place to start asking, right? Like where are you seeing it? We do know that we asked this similar question in the finance survey a year ago. They're at a much higher percentage in adoption in this, right? So yeah. Those were sort of the big key things I wanted to cover today with your audience. There is a lot more.
I did have one question on the mass resignation. Did you look at the age demographics of that? Is it true that it's mostly older, aging workers that are leaving more? I mean, tell me about some of the demographics of that.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So well, there is a quick, short little question item here where we ask organizations every year over the next 12 months, over the last 12 months, were you able to retain your top talent, attract top talent, or improve your employee engagement? And we saw the biggest drop this year in retaining top talent and attracting top talent in the 10 years that we've asked this question. So first off, yes, this is happening from HR's perspective. They are having a hard time doing this, right? Like this data fits with what we're hearing. To your point about who they're losing, I don't have it in this particular deck. It's in the report, but we actually did an analysis. Like we ask every year, give us your average percentage of your workforce that's falling into the different generations, whether that's baby boomer, Gen X, millennials, right? And Gen Zs. And every year it changes slightly, as you would expect, right? A little more Gen Zs, a little fewer baby boomers, the whole bit, right? This year we saw a 20% drop, 20% in the average percentage of baby boomers and the average percentage of Gen X. So now that's an average of an average. So my data is not going to be as good as labor statistic data, but it's a very good indicator that when companies are looking at their overall numbers, they are definitely seeing a drop in the percentage of their workforce at that Gen X and that baby boomer, no matter how you sort of categorize it, right? But at that range. And we did not see a huge uptick in Gen Z or millennial numbers either, right? Like that average didn't bump up dramatically to address that drop that we saw, because you would assume a little bit of that's just transitioning. So, I mean, I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you our data is validating what you're hearing there. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to put in a word for my generation. There's I mean, obviously, look, from a diversity perspective, it's nice to see all that focus on gender and ethnicity. I think age needs to become much more of a focus going forward.
I would agree. Well, and I think not just age, but what's going on in your work life, right? Like in your life balance. So the part of the reason you're seeing so much Gen Xers drop out of the workforce, it isn't just that there's a lot of moms in that category. So there's women who had to take care of children, but they're also the category that is taking care of parents or other members of their household, right? So that caretaker generation, if you want to call it that, right? So that 20% drop there is huge, because that is sort of what you would assume would be sort of the leadership level that is rolling into leadership roles. And we're losing a lot of people in that workforce generation. And I do think, to your point, for the baby boomer generation, whatever, range that is for everyone, we have to think that that work environment has to be more flexible, right? It has to be more accommodating. And none of those things, I think, are things that we're having a conversation. We're talking about engagement in the sense of, better work environments, but it is truly, the need is, I still want to work, I still need to work, but it means you need to be more flexible for me, right? And I don't know that we're really thinking about that in that way, right?
I think there's a societal issue, which is, at least with the younger cohorts, we have to make work, we have to glorify work more.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that sounds old fashioned. I tell my kids, it's happened all through history. Our last names reflect our professions,
Yes.
we've honored it for generations. Why does suddenly work not, why is it not important? So
Yes.
we've
It
got
is.
glorify is probably the wrong term, but you know what I mean. I mean, you got to tell people, work is an essential part of life. It's fulfilling. It just gives you a lot of, whatever.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. And I actually do think, I think we'll be surprised that the generation, the Gen Zs, as we're calling them, right, that are coming up, I do think they are starting to understand this, right? I do think we are starting to see more, whether it's a focus on their family needs or a focus on their they want to travel more, or they want to be, in more volunteer opportunities. They are looking at their lives and how they work with work in a way differently, I think. Now, the question is that going to fit, I think, with the vision of what we have, which is you need to separate the two worlds, right? I think there's a lot more conversation about bringing those worlds together, working with people that are my family or working with people that I enjoy, and that kind of conversation. I'm not sure how well that's going to work for everybody as much as they think, right? But
I think that is less something an individual corporation can do, but I think from an educational, political perspective, I like to tell young people, read the Bureau of Labor Statistics report. It's boring as hell, but it gives you the most accurate reflection of what the market needs. Listen to the market signals. Don't just go get a college degree just because you think it's fashionable or you think it's going to ensure success. If the market doesn't need it, you won't be as successful. So
yes. Right now, plumbers should be on anybody who likes to use their hands list, right?
plumbers, welders,
Yes.
truck drivers. I mean, all trades have been neglected. We haven't been nice to trades for a long time. Time to make them, glorify them.
I'm there with you on that one. My dad was a vocational teacher, Vinnie, so you'll never get a whip on me on that one. He was a trade teacher long before it was in vogue, and I think we need to make it in vogue again. So, Vinnie, it's been a pleasure. This has been so much fun. I always love talking to your audience. Please, if anybody has any questions, reach out to me, connect with me on LinkedIn, or feel free to sort of download the link. I think you're going to put it in the blog. So,
Stacey, thank you so much.